2018 Nicaraguan protests timeline of events. Start of protests. Citizens protest on 18 April after already being angered by the handling of the fires in response to the Ortega administration's announcement of Social Security reforms that raised income and payroll taxes while reducing pension benefits by 5%. Demonstrations involving mostly elderly individuals, university students, and other activists broke out in Managua and 6 other cities, which were met with a heavy response from the authorities ordered by President Ortega. Authorities were seen using live ammunition on protesters while also arming Sandinista youth members with weapons. At least 26 people were killed, including journalist Angel Gana of the news program Meridiano, with Gana being shot to death outside of the City Hall in Bluefields while streaming on Facebook Live. Various forms of independent media were censored during the protests. The following day on 19 April, Vice President and First Lady Rosario Murillo made a speech mocking the demonstrators and labeling them of small groups, small souls, toxic, full of hate, bent on the destruction of the country, attempting against peace and development. She also labeled the demonstrators that had been attacked as aggressors in the attack by pro-Ortega groups and police as legitimate defense. Protests began to intensify with confrontations occurring in León, Managua, Granada, Boaco, Carazo, Esteli, Rivas, Matagalpa, and Masaya. Telcor ordered the suspension of transmissions of 4 independent TV channels that were reporting the news, channels 12, 23, 51, and 100% Noticias. Also the Catholic Episcopal Conference's TV channel. The suspension lasted several hours, except for 100% Noticias, who was out of the air until 25 April. Murillo accused the protesters of being manipulated and trying to destabilize and destroy Nicaragua. 2 days after the beginning of protests and the subsequent crackdown by authorities, Ortega makes his first public appearance on 21 April and announced he would hold negotiations for possible revision of the reforms, planned to take effect on 1 July. However, he said he would only meet with business leaders and alleged that demonstrators were being manipulated by gangs and other political interests. Demonstrations increased in response, with protesters objecting to the repression of demonstrations and the exclusion of other sectors from the negotiations, as well as the reforms themselves. The business chamber COSEP announced it would only participate in the negotiation if police violence ceased, detained protesters were released and free speech was restored. Nicaragua's Roman Catholic Conference of Bishops also called for an end to the police violence and criticized unilateral reforms. Pope Francis subsequently added his call for peace in the country. Cancellation of Social Security reforms. As the press began to describe the unrest as the biggest crisis of Ortega's presidency, Ortega announced the cancellation of the Social Security reforms on 22 April, acknowledging they were not viable and had created a dramatic situation. He again proposed negotiations on the issue, this time to include Catholic Cardinal Leopoldo Brenes as well as the business community. On 23 April, marches of citizens, businessmen and students were held in Managua demanding the end of violence in the country, the release of students arrested by the police, the cessation of censorship of television media, and a response from the government about the students who died during the protests. The protests were the largest seen during the Ortega administration, with tens to hundreds of thousands of demonstrators participating and calling for the president's resignation. The next day on 24 April, 200 detainees were released by Nicaraguan authorities as a result of dialogue between the government and other organizations. Investigations and resignations. Nicaraguan Attorney General Inés Miranda announced on 26 April that a formal investigation into the deaths during the protests. On 27 April, President of the National Assembly Gustavo Porras announced a truth commission to examine the deaths and violence during the unrest. Head of the National Police Aminta Granera announced her resignation in face of the criticism of her handling of the unrest and alleged police repression of protests. Protests intensify. Hundreds of thousands participated in marches for peace and justice organized on 28 April by the Catholic churches in Nicaragua in the cities of Managua, Matagalpa, and León. At the events, bishops, feminists, homosexuals, family members of those killed in the repression, and thousands of peasants gathered in unity to demonstrate. Peasants who lived in rural areas traveled to Managua by a caravan of trucks, arriving to protest against the Nicaragua Canal proposal by Chinese businessmen and the Ortega government. Days later, on 30th of April, tens of thousands of Ortega's supporters participated in a rally showing him support, though there were some reports of government workers being forced to join the pro-Ortega rally. The rally consisted mostly of singing and dancing to music of the 1960s and 1970s, popular to the former Sandinista guerrillas. On 2nd of May, police in riot gear blocked a student march from Central American University, UCA, to the National Assembly, with students instead marching to the Polytechnic University of Nicaragua, UPLI, to show solidarity with other groups entrenched there. After pro-Ortega groups appeared on their route, they cancelled another planned march, so students reinforced barricades surrounding UPLI under the watch of authorities. Anonymous Nicaragua hacked the website of the National Police of Nicaragua, calling for them to support of anti-Ortega protesters. The next day, elite troops of the Nicaraguan armed forces and police assaulted UPLI in the early morning at about 1 o'clock count, dispersing students stationed at the university. The incident left 6 students injured, 1 seriously. Student group Movimiento 19 de Abril responded to the incident stating that they would not participate in a dialogue with Ortega after he sent forces to attack them, placing peace talks in jeopardy. By 9th of May, members of the independent press of Nicaragua condemned the killings, censorship and repression of the government of Nicaragua. More than 10 cities were the scene of heavy fighting on 12th of May in at least 8 departments in the north, center, and Pacific areas of Nicaragua. The biggest clashes took place in Chinandega, Granada, León, Managua, Masaya, and Rivas in the Pacific, as well as Esteli and Matagalpa in the north. In Masaya, the clashes lasted for more than 12 hours between demonstrators, anti-riot police and youth shock groups of the ruling Sandinista party. The following day, President Ortega called for a cessation of violence, reading a short statement, in which he called for an end to death and destruction that does not continue to shed blood of Nicaraguan brothers. The military of Nicaragua assured that it would not engage in acts of repression against citizens who were protesting and advocated a dialogue to help resolve the crisis in the country, according to statements made by spokesman Colonel Manuel Guevara. In a demonstration, thousands of people arrived on 13th of May from Managua to Masaya in a caravan to support that city for the loss of at least 1 life and 150 wounded in the past days. National dialogue. After weeks of conflict, the national dialogue begins on 16th of May. When Ortega and Murillo arrived at the seminary of Our Lady of Fatima, the site of the national dialogue, the presidential couple was greeted with shouts of assassins, murderers by people on the outskirts of the event. A delegation from the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, IACR, arrived in Nicaragua on 17th of May to observe in loco the situation of human rights in the country. The IACR visit occurred as Nicaraguan human rights organizations were reporting between 61 and 67 people dead and more than 500 injured in the repression exercised against protesters. The delegation was headed by Antonia Urrejola, rapporteur for Nicaragua at the IACR. On 18th of May, the second day of dialogue, the IACR now included in talks called on the state of Nicaragua to immediately cease the repression of the protest. The Commission also calls on the state to guarantee the independence and functioning of the media in the country, the rapporteur said, also indicating that the mission of the IACR in the country will be the observation in the field in accordance with human rights. She indicated that she would meet with all sectors. There was friction between university students and members of the state media press before the dialogue. The government and the Nicaraguan opposition agreed to a truce over the weekend, a month after having started demonstrations and protests. Several people appeared before the Inter-American Commission to lodge complaints against the violations carried out by the police forces and supporters of the Daniel Ortega government. The national dialogue continued on its third day on 21st of May, where the resignation of Ortega and his wife and the Nicaraguan government was requested in order to return the country to normality. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, IACR, issued a preliminary report on the investigations of what happened in the protests in Nicaragua. The IACR counted at least 76 people killed in the protests in Nicaragua and more than 800 injured, and denounced serious events and violations of human rights by the government of Nicaragua. It included the official visit of the IACR to Nicaragua. The representatives of the organization were in Managua, Masaya, León, and Matagalpa. A week after beginning, The national dialogue between the government of Nicaragua and students, the private sector and civil society was suspended indefinitely. The leader of the Nicaraguan Catholic Church, Bishop Leopoldo Brenes, who had acted as a mediator of this dialogue, explained that the lack of agreement on an agenda of issues to be discussed prevented negotiations from continuing. Clashes began. On 30th of May, the day on which the Nicaraguan mothers are celebrated, a march was held in honor of the victims killed during the protests. It was repressed by the national police in the company of paramilitary groups and pro-government mobs, leaving approximately 15 dead. Most of the victims died from accurate shots to the head, neck and chest. The march was led by the Mothers of April movement, the student movement 19th of April, civil society and private enterprise. In the early hours of 1st of June, Masaya reported that there had been a new wave of looting and robberies against businesses and stores in the city. Movements, associations of professionals and Nicaraguan social groups called for a civic citizen national strike and civil disobedience since 1 June, as a means of pressure for President Daniel Ortega and his wife, Vice President Rosario Murillo, to leave power. 5 banks have closed in Masaya for lootings. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, IACR, condemned the deaths and new acts of violence that occurred in Nicaragua and urged the state to stop the repression of the protests. The IACR also urges the government to investigate and punish the use of force by parapolitical actors, dismantle these groups, and seek a peaceful, constitutional and democratic solution to the current political crisis affecting the country. On 8th of July, at least 38 were killed during skirmishes between protesters, authorities and pro-Sandinista paramilitary groups, raising the death toll to more than 300 Nicaraguans killed since the beginning of protests. Attacks on bishops in opposition. Mobs, some hooded and armed, set out on 9th of July surrounding and assaulted Catholic bishops, including Cardinal Leopoldo Brenes and the ambassador of the Pope in Nicaragua Valdemar Stanislaus Omertag, after arriving in Durayamba, Carazo. Men in plain clothes, hooded and some armed, first verbally offended the religious and then attacked them physically, wounding some of them, while the journalists robbed and beat. The next day, Vice President of Nicaragua, Rosario Murillo, said that the government presiding over her husband, Daniel Ortega, is indestructible and that the opposition could not defeat him, while also justifying the actions of violence against the Nicaraguan bishops and the apostolic nuncio in Durayamba. On 11th of July, the Nicaraguan opposition and academic Felix Maradiaga was attacked in the city of Leon, northwest Nicaragua, by a group of Sandinista sympathizers of the government of President Daniel Ortega. Church of Divine Mercy incident. Police and paramilitaries attacked the Ruben Dario University campus, RURD, of the UNAN Managua on 13th of July. After hours of facing attacks, more than 100 students took refuge in the nearby Church of Divine Mercy where they were fired upon by police and paramilitaries. After the youths left the facilities, the paramilitaries set fire to the university campus, setting fire to a CDI in one of the pavilions of the college. The Church of Divine Mercy was then the target of attacks and was besieged throughout the night of Friday the 13th and into the early morning of Saturday the 14th, leaving 2 students dead. The bullet holes in the walls, windows and religious objects in addition to the bloodstains were still visible in the days following the attack. On 14th of July, clashes were reported in Granada, Masaya, and Managua, leaving 2 students killed by Nicaraguan police and pro-government paramilitary forces had to go with the presence of Cardinal Brenes, the apostolic nuncio, accompanied by members of the national and international organizations to rescue the wounded and besieged. Those rescued were received at the Cathedral of Managua, where they were received by ecclesiastical authorities and national and international human rights organizations. In the cathedral were also dozens of people waving flags of Nicaragua and UNAN to receive the students. Government stands firm. As a result of crackdowns in July 2018, the government forced people from protest centers and established a more firm presence in Nicaragua, though protests still continued in the following months. The international community intensified pressure on the government of Nicaragua on 16th of July in order to stop the repression and disarm the paramilitaries after nearly 300 deaths during 3 months of protests demanding the exit of President Daniel Ortega. The United States, 13 Latin American countries and the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, demanded Ortega to end the repression of the demonstration. The Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights also denounced the law on terrorism that was recently approved by the pro-Ortega Parliament of Nicaragua, which it said can be used to criminalize peaceful protests. On 17 July, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Nicaragua raised its strongest protest for the biased declarations of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, defending the law on terrorism. Days later, on 24 July, President Ortega said that he will not resign from the presidency of Nicaragua before finishing his term in 2021, ignoring the demand of opponents who demand his immediate exit from power to overcome the crisis. National strike. An early September general strike organized to demand the release of political prisoners saw 90% participation throughout Nicaragua. It was estimated that the national strike cost the country $20 million to $25 million per day. Ban on protests. On September 29, 2018, President Ortega declared that political protests were illegal in Nicaragua, with Ortega stating that demonstrators would respond to justice if they attempted to publicly voice their concerns. The United Nations condemned the actions as being a violation of human rights regarding freedom of assembly.